So Apple just came out with their new AR headset, the Apple Vision. But have you ever wondered how our current reality is actually an augmented reality? Well, today we have a very special episode with Barbara Tversky that dives into just that, how we construct our reality. And it's all about spatial cognition. We live in this 3D world, we take that world and compress it with language, and then we output those conceptual relations back into the built reality by building maps and lines and shared concepts. So yeah, our current reality is already this augmented reality. As always, let me know what you think of the episode and stay until the end to hear her overrated and underrated. Thanks. Hello, Rhys's Pieces. I'm Rhys, the founder of Root, and welcome to The Rhys Show. I believe we can make a great Earth by 2100, an Earth that we're proud of. And we're here to work backwards from that good future. And so this podcast interviews experts to empower you, the listener, a serious and curious frontier person with both frameworks and agency to build a better future. And today, I'm excited to chat with Barbara Tversky. Barbara is a professor emerita of psychology at Stanford University. She's an expert in cognition and wrote the excellent book, Mind in Motion, How Action Shapes Thought. Barbara, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to dive in. And Barbara is a great person because I think for me, I'm like a natural visual thinker, but I don't really know what's happening, like how the sausage gets made. And so hopefully you'll be able to teach us how it all works and like how visual, and we're so used to the kind of the vocal world. And so it'll be great to dive into the importance of spatial cognition and like using those learnings to make our brain work better. So I want to kind of start with spatial cognition generally, which is that, language really is, it's so natural to us. And so like, it's hard to understand how we're like, it's this weird water we swim in. And so maybe just to start for myself and the listeners, what is spatial cognition?
So thank you. This will be a pretty long answer. I hope that's okay.
Totally
But
okay.
we all creatures, even viruses, live in a world, in a spatial world, and they need to move toward things that will sustain them and away from things that will harm them. So the basic decision that even viruses have to make is what to approach and what to avoid. And that basic decision is a decision about acting in space. And it comes with emotion. There are positive emotions towards things that will sustain us, and negative emotions keeping us away from things that will harm us. So that basic decision, whether to approach or avoid, is replete with emotion, and it's the basis for spatial cognition. It's how do we behave or think about behaving the spaces we inhabit. And the human brain has many areas of the cortex and below the cortex devoted to spatial thinking. It took a long time to evolve, and there are many areas of the brain that are substrates for spatial thinking, for behaving in space, for remembering space, making cognitive maps of where things are relative to each other. And what's extraordinary in humans is those same strata that encode spatial thinking encode abstract thinking. So we can think about things that we like, don't like. We can think about people that are close to us, not about social spaces, about spaces in time, and conceptual spaces. And those spaces are represented spatially in the brain. So that's the brain foundation for my claim that spatial thinking is the foundation of all thought.
Yeah.
A great deal of that is in hippocampus and neighboring areas. And again, in humans, these support thinking about just about everything. You want to keep your hippocampus alive, don't let it shrink, don't endanger it. It's important.
Okay, I'll keep my hippo. I have a hippo, and I'll keep my hippo safe in my backyard, and I'll keep my hippocampus in my brain also safe. I think I love what you say there about it's a reminder for us that there's a that yeah, we are, we didn't just pop out of something. It's like, no, there was apes before us, and there were other mammals before us, and that there's a yeah, all animals have this approach avoid thing, and so we all have a spatial sense of the world, and we kind of understand spatially as we're like biking around and we like dodge something, but this bonus one, which I think is really really interesting, which is mapping the spatial world to the abstract world. And I know for me, again, personally, it's like I kind of do that naturally in some ways, or it's like there's like graphs. You can think we had 2D graphs or like, I don't know, 3D graphs or like putting things. But tell us more about that intersection between abstract thought and spatial thought.
So we see it in language. All good things go up. When we feel good, we stand straight. When we feel bad, we slump. We can see that in other people instantaneously if they're up or down. So we even use up and down to describe mood. It's there in all cultures, it's not just English. We say someone's at the top of the heap or someone's fallen into a depression. So we use that vertical dimension in language and in gesture, as I've just done, top of the heap, fallen into a depression. So it comes naturally in gesture. We do it without thinking about making gestures. They happen to us. And in fact, they tend to precede speech. But we have those metaphors in or ways of speaking in speech in every languages. Up is good, powerful, more, and down is hell. Up is heaven. So down is the opposite. And it's probably tied to gravity, which is the major asymmetric force in the world. And so going up takes resources. It takes health, it takes money, it takes strength. We all grow taller, most of us, as we get older. Then, when we get really old, we start to shrink. We're less powerful. So it's fighting gravity, going against gravity, takes those resources. And that seems to account for the idea that up is in general good, more, and so forth. Our piles of money grow taller. So there are many reasons, but the fundamental one is probably gravity, why we have this conceptual mapping that up is good and down is bad. So economists seem to violate that. Bad things like inflation and unemployment go up. And we could say economists are perverse, but I'd rather not say that. And instead, it's because numbers go up. So inflation is measured in numbers, so is unemployment, and the numbers go up. And if you have two conflicting dimensions that are vying for the vertical, then often numbers win, and that's why the bad things, inflation and employment, go up. Unemployment seem to go up. So horizontal is more neutral. There's nothing in the world that is asymmetric around horizontal. Our bodies are slightly asymmetrical. Most of us are right handed, and a few of us are left handed. And that seems to play a role in value. There's been some work by Daniel Casacento that right handed people tend to use their right hand for good things, their left hand for bad things, the reverse and left handed. But other dimensions don't get mapped that way onto right and left. What seems to be a powerful determinant for asymmetries along the horizontal is reading and writing. So most European languages go left to right, and many Middle Eastern and Asian languages go right to left. And so certain things like increasing time or even increasing value go left to right in cultures that read and write left to right, and seem to reverse in cultures that write and read right to left. But that gets complicated because even those cultures see standard graphing, which does go left to right. So I've given a complicated
That's
answer
great.
to that, but they again those spatial thinking is evident in our language and in our gestures. And gestures are something that come early in life. Small babies point before they speak, but they gradually make many other gestures. So gestures are a spontaneous component that expresses thought and also helps other people to understand thought.
Yeah, I love it. It makes me think of, well, when you start to think about visual think of, and visual and spatial cognition, it's like not only it's not just gestures, it's also kind of the words we're using and kind of mapping stuff into an abstract space in front of us. And so it's kind of yeah, multidimensional in that way. And then in terms of the mapping stuff, it makes me think of, when I first heard these terms about like just being able to see our language for what it really is and really trying to see the water that we swim in, where you can imagine so much of politics or whatever is stuff where you're like, oh, here's this, I'll try to use a neutral term. Here's an immigrant that's coming into the United States or whatever. And you can use a negative valence term and say, oh, that's an illegal alien or whatever. Or you can use a positive valence term and say, oh, that's a undocumented, immigrant or whatever. And so you can kind of, when you start to see people use the positive and negative forms, you can start to be like, oh, wow, this is, you can start to see kind of the emotional valence going up and down with language that people are using. I think similarly for me, it's been helpful to, in your explanation there is like, once we start to see like, oh, okay, the words that we're each using, you can kind of add an additional layer on that, which is the spatial layer. And you're like, oh, here's kind of the visual metaphors that we're using as we're speaking about what we're speaking about. I want to ask a question about the x-axis there, because I agree with your y-axis stuff. I feel like for me the x-axis is so much time. It's like it's very often time. Is that, what do you think about that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of work on that. That time seems to be horizontal. And we did some work showing that actually loaded variables that are loaded in variance or value, tend to be mapped on the vertical, and that neutral things like time seem to be mapped on the horizontal. And that's again true in many languages, and you see it in the prepositions. We're going forward, we're approaching the holidays, or the holidays are behind us. We're using spatial ways to talk about time. And on the whole, for most languages, it seems to be horizontal. It's as if we were going on a timeline, or that we were on a timeline and things were coming to us. And there's been a lot of work on those two metaphors, and some work showing that there's also a vertical way of mapping time. We have that in calendars. Many calendars start, the early part of the month is up, and the later part of the month or year is down. So the first things we encounter are up, and the last things we encounter are down. So we do, in Chinese in particular, but other languages use an up and down. For time, it's more unusual, but yes, we tend to see time. Time marches. It's
Yeah.
again on the ground. We're walking on the ground. And we found that children we examine children who grow up in English speaking environments, that grow up in Arabic speaking environments, that grow up in Hebrew speaking environments. So preschoolers who aren't reading yet for the most part, and have them map time, temporal events, breakfast, lunch, dinner. And we found most of them used a horizontal line, a few vertical, but mostly horizontal. And for the most part, it went in reading order. But again, there are these variations that happen
Yeah.
with reading order.
I love that. It's funny. It's like, yeah, you got that like weird kid in the corner who did it, like top to bottom. It's like, okay, that's it. That person's mind. That's going to be a creative. That's going to be an art person. It makes me think too about there's this good book called The Unfolding of Language, which gets at the preposition thing that you just chatted about, which is that as language began to emerge, and who knows about all the stuff you've known more than I do, there was a we just had kind of nouns and verbs, and then we'd say like, oh, um, that the something being in front of or behind me, those things went from a you should just talk about your butt as your behind, but then you're like, no, you can use the behind idea to talk about something that is behind you, and so we can start to, or like, like I want or I will becomes these kind of future facing things that you're going to go towards. And so it's like we start in this kind of simple, spatially organized world of nouns and verbs, and then it becomes the prepositions and all these other things, as those kind of physical metaphors kind of infest the rest of our language. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like the kind of how language itself evolved with with spatial cognition?
So it's awfully hard to study how language
Yeah.
evolved.
Yeah.
Written languages began way after people were speaking, and we can't really know what kind of language people used ages ago, prehistory. And again, there was no writing, there's no way of knowing by knowing DNA. There's a little bit that's known by studying e- languages spoken in the Amazon and other places where people haven't been schooled. And mostly what's been studied there is not so much what parts of speech, because those languages seem to have all parts of speech, but numbers. And there's some language being studied in deaf communities that where the people weren't exposed to sign and made up languages. They made up signed languages. So, what concepts come easy for them and what don't? And I'm not up to date on that work, but a book that just came out by Susan Golden Meadow it reports on her research with home sign and what concepts tended to be worked through in language before others. I don't I mean, there must be something there on when parts of speech evolve. And my hunch is similar to yours that because we're pointing to things, nouns are, and we can enact verbs to a certain extent, but it's harder. Prepositions are relations between one thing and another. So conceptually, they're denser, and it might be the case that they come later. There's been a lot of work on how prepositions map to space, and they differ across languages enormously. So one of the mistakes that people make in learning a new language is not mapping the prepositions correctly because they're often very idiosyncratic to languages. Some have many, and even Korean has one for fitting tightly the way a ring would, or fitting loosely the way kaftan would. We don't make that distinction in English. So there are, and again, those prepositions do map to space and to spatial relations,
Yeah,
but they
exactly.
can map differently in different languages.
That's cool. Yeah, it makes me think that there's like there's like, you can imagine a level one reality where you're just living your life, not really thinking about how you're speaking. A level two reality is where you can see spatial cognition in all of the languages that in all of our language. And then level three is like being able to do a cross language, which is something that, like, oh, how does Korean work? How does, and being able to like, to kind of find some core concepts there. And I think, yeah, it's a really interesting, the other thing I want to chat about here is you have this great concept. I think we've been chatting about this kind of matrix that you can see of when you start to like see the world and language as this spatial thing. But then you have these great two little kind of phrases in your book about we put the world in our mind and we also put our mind in the world. And so there's this kind of in addition to it all being like existing in our minds, there's also this like weird kind of feedback loop with reality itself. And so tell us more about what you mean by those two statements and how that changed us.
So I'll get to that because it's a, but let me just add about space in language.
Yeah.
We often say our minds are going in circles, our thoughts are going in circles or zigzags. So we do think of thinking in spatial ways. Or our minds are going all over in many different directions. And the underlying structure there is often networks, which are how do you get from one thought to another thought? And again, that has parallels in how do I get from one place to another place. So again, the way we think about thinking and the directions our thoughts go is very much the way we think about the way our bodies move in space. I couldn't get a handle on that. I couldn't grasp it. So our hands are going to do different things than our feet. And humans have unique hands, as we know. Our hands can play pianos beautifully, violins beautifully, make beautiful art. They can do delicate things that other creatures' hands can't do. And again, we use our hands as a way of thinking about thinking, not being able to grasp something. So I wanted to just point that out that the language is embedded in with the way we talk about thinking and the way we talk about talking. And much of that comes from things we do with our hands and things we do with our feet in space.
Yes. I
So
love that. Let me just reflect that for a second before you do the next thing, which is, yeah, it's like an amazing, the way we talk about language itself is, and ideas themselves are spatial, and it's ideas you can grasp, and oh, that was kind of a wandering conversation or whatever, and so these ideas are kind of going off the chains or whatever, and so you can kind of, you see it all. Yeah, the way we talk about it is also, I mean, everything has to be spatial, and so the way you talk about it also has to be spatial. Okay, thank you for the double click there. Yeah, so tell us about this world in the mind in the world thing. Yeah.
So, a world in the mind, again, how do we represent space? And the neuroscientists have done a beautiful work in the last 20, 30, even 40 years on showing how the world is represented in hippocampus and nearby areas, hands in other areas, but that we have a great deal of the brain dedicated to representing what the outside world is like and how to navigate it. Half the cortex is spatial. So, and spatial is, blind people can have excellent spatial cognition because it's spatial, not just visual. And they navigate in other ways with landmarks that are visual, but might be sound or smell or texture on the ground. Also, using time, you pointed out the nice parallels between space and time, and there's lots more to say about that. The mental maps of rats, for example, are established by movement and time. So time and movement are right there in our representations, internal representations of space. Humans have the advantage of using language to create spatial representations. We don't have to experience traveling in Rome. I can build a mental map of Rome just from descriptions of it or maps of it. And I often do that when I travel. I study a map and I read descriptions in order to know what I'll be experiencing when I experience it. So that's putting the world in the mind. Humans make maps. And maps go way back into antiquity. You can find remnants of them going back 10,000 years, even farther, long before written language was there. Maps in the sand probably went back farther, they just aren't preserved. So we've put the world in our minds into the world in the form of maps, rudimentary ones. and more exact ones for eons. Again, they go way back. What else do we put in the world? Again, our evidence often is cave paintings or petroglyphs. These were very difficult to create. I mean, you have to have cave paintings, you have to know paints that will stay on the walls. You're going in the dark. There are dangers there because if there are no real paths and that you can suddenly have fall off a ledge, so you needed light in some way to carry in there. So making cave paintings is a huge effort, and what they put in cave paintings then had to be significant. Same with petroglyphs, you have to carve in stone, and that's a great deal of effort. So all of those ways, or carving pieces of wood, which was also a way to preserve maps, or stringing bamboo together, another way of all of that takes great effort and great knowledge. So, but we people have done it for millennia, and there must be reasons why people did it. So, those are the spatial things are important parts of our lives. What else did we put in the world? We put images of people, often people in hunts. So stick men with bows and arrows you can find all over the world, or stick people with bows and arrows. On a hunt, you find animals. Again, they were important sources of protein to people. So you find putting our mind in the world went way back. There's also number, not number as we know it with numerals, but tallies. And tallies go way back and all over the world. One-to-one correspondences between something and a mark on a tally. And that takes a great deal of abstraction, thinking of thinking of things just as one example, one person, or one bushel of wheat, and not thinking about the wheat or the person, abstracting it to a single entity and stringing together entities. Takes abstraction, and again, tallies went way back, and they're out there in the world representing things. So we've put our mind in the world for generations, more than we can count. But we can see the mind and the world in cities everywhere. There are lines separating lanes for cars. There are lines for buses, lines for bicycles, lines where you can park, lines where you can't park. There are signs where you can turn, signs where you can't turn, stoplights, zebra, zebra stripes for pedestrians where you must stop for them. So we've essentially turned the world into a diagram, and that allows us to move safely and prevents us from moving in places where we would endanger each other or other things. But we're hardly aware of the fact that we're moving in a diagram, living in a diagram. More and more. We design the world, and part of that is not just building homes and streets and hospitals and stores. We put diagrams on the streets and in the this close air that guide our movements and
Yeah.
control our movements. So the mind in the world is there. It's there in diagrams. It's there in photographs. It's there. You can't read a textbook without having diagrams and visualizations. It's there in writing. And writing began as pictographs or ideographs. The alphabet was invented only once.
Yeah.
Most languages began in this pictographic way. You run out of pictographs quite quickly. Their verbs are problematic, nouns are easier. So eventually, people, instead of developing this visual correspondence, thought of developing a sound correspondence. hence the alphabet. And again, the alphabet was invented once, but adapted to many, many different languages.
Thank God they invented it. I'm glad, that whoever that, that random person was. I think it's a great and I love thinking about it, it's like there's and just to kind of reflect what you said there, there's like we're living in the world, and you can imagine the world without us is just doing its thing. There's trees and there's random things, or there's the earth. But then what we do is we kind of take that all as input into our brains, and so we're kind of putting the world into our mind, and that's both reflected like neurobiologically, in terms of the structures that it turns into, in terms of nested hierarchies or whatever. And so that kind of those concepts and that physical world out there is actually put into our brains. And then what we do is then we kind of externalize it again, and we say, okay, great, here's like this, here's what I understood the world to be, here's a map of it, here's what Rome looks like on a map or whatever. And so there's this like, yeah, taking it in and then pushing out like kind of our kind of compressed, abstractized representation of whatever we took in. And then in addition to that, like seeing our world, whatever, whenever we move around the world these days, or I'm in my room right now, it's like, my room is not some kind of white box. The room is full of there's a thing on the door that says to turn it, that has like a little knob, and there's the window is a square so I can look through it or whatever. And so all this, thinking of everything as a diagram that tells us like where we should go. That's kind of the world we live in, is this kind of manufactured spatial reality. Is that did you have any thoughts on that reflection?
So, yeah, no, absolutely. And I can go in a supermarket in Japan and know how to purchase.
Yeah.
I know it's going to be organized in a certain way, and there'll probably be a cash register or a self register somewhere where I can figure out how to pay. If it's some of it will have icons which help me. Often it will have a translation, but I can figure out those things, how to buy tickets on trains in various places and so forth. Now, there are cultures that do things differently. I went to China just before the pandemic and couldn't use American credit cards, and there was almost no cash. So I needed Chinese accounts with a Chinese bank and so forth. Things I didn't have time to do, but for Chinese, and they're a third of the world, they have a wonderful system for getting through. And again, not much of it is organized and diagrammed, so I can get to some of that. I just might hit barriers
Yeah.
at some point. But yeah, I mean, we have redesigned the world and the spaces that we need to live in. Nobody's seen a gorilla make a map in the sand or a bonobo. They do gesture, but the gestures are not nearly as complicated or expressive as ours. As my understanding is, they're often for grooming, that you want someone else to groom, or for sex, or for food. You want the mother to share whatever she's eating. But and even pointing, they will apparently point, large apes, but their conspecifics don't necessarily follow the point. And
Yeah.
following the point is really for caretakers and children is a huge boon because it does bootstrap language. It also bootstraps joint attention. If I point to something and you look at it, we're thinking about the same thing. And maybe the baby is indicating it's a toy they want. Maybe it's indicating it's something they want to eat. Maybe it's indicating a place they want to be taken. But if I follow the baby's point or vice versa, then we have mutual understanding. We're communicating.
Yeah.
So it that kind of spatial communication forms the basis for language, and it forms the basis for society. And we humans aren't faster or maybe even smarter. We're certainly not bigger or stronger or faster than many of the animals that we evolved with and might be interested in consuming us. Our competitive advantage is working together,
Yeah.
and and having these gestures and joint attention form the link between caretakers and children, and later form the basis of cooperation. um, that's hugely important in protecting us. We can't live alone.
Yeah, I
We,
love that. I think it's a great um
we yeah, we need each other and depend on each other. So forming those social links, which are initially spatial, are critical.
Yeah, it's like a shared, like a and there's a book called Crucial Conversations, which is about like it's kind of like a nonviolent communication, like how to have good conversations with people book. And it talks about making a shared third rail with someone when you're like, if you and I were like having a, an emotional argument or whatever, we like try to agree on the facts of like what happened or whatever. And so it's like, and so this like shared agreement of this like shared map that we can both point at either through pointing and diagrams and all these things then allows us to do this like massive coordination thing that humans are so good at. So I want to ask you a question, kind of switching gears here for a second to so we know there's this spatial reality that we live in. We've taken the red pill or the blue pill, the red pill. We've taken the red pill and we're we're spatially pilled now. How what should we do? Like how do I get better at spatial reasoning and cognition? How what to do?
It's like everything practice. Paying attention, looking. Since I got interested in gesture, I look at gesture everywhere, and I really see how important it is in coordinating. So, finding your way around the world, pay attention to what you're seeing, what the landmarks are when you come back. Um, it, Science depends a great deal on spatial thinking, graphs, what's close to what, what's interacting with what, social behavior. But in all those things, practice helps. Now, a lot of games are spatial, so it's built in to the way children grow up, or much of it is built in. I know I used to give my kids maps when we were traveling in the car and ask them to be the navigators. And have them draw maps when they were little of their rooms, and all that is fun. And building Lego is fun. All I mean, the games that kids play, blocks, all of that is great fun, and they learn to manipulate things in space, and that learning eventually gets internalized, and so it spurs imaginations. Once you have all that inside your head and represented inside your head, you can use it in thinking and creating and imagining. So the more experiences that we have with puzzles and with board games, and so, which again are spatial, and creating things, all of that helps our spatial thinking, and in turn forms the basis for the abstract thinking, so that we can. I mean, even clinical psychologists will have people make these mental maps, social maps. Who are you close to? Who are you not close to? So you map that out. You map out what are your goals, what's close to you in your goals temporally or feasibly, and what seems a little distant, and how do I arrange those in space relative to me? How might I see someone else's perspective? That perspective taking becomes crucial in any kind of social interaction, political interaction. So thinking about my perspective, but thinking about what's there, how are they seeing the world? What's close to them? What's not? What annoys them? What's their perspective? And then what's the perspective overhead of the whole organization I'm in? How do people relate to each other? And ideas relate to each other. So that kind of mapping that for some of us almost comes automatic, but doing it purposefully, it can be a big boon. and just asking that, how would X see these things? Not how do you see X and why are you angry at X? How does X see it? That perspective taking is again crucial to both navigating the real world and navigating the social world. Um, and
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of, it's like, how there's the answer to, like, oh, how should we use spatial cognition in our daily lives. It's kind of like the answer is not, oh, well, to train your hippocampus you need to do this specific. It's like, no, 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 no. What you need to do is you need to make maps, just kind of map stuff. And even this is inspiring me to be like, yeah, as I think about it, kind of makes me think of, like, whatever, like, this is like a bullet journal or whatever that I'm taking notes in. And it's like, it is and I'll often do some mapping stuff for, like, the book I'm writing or whatever. I'll kind of like, what is actually happening with this? But to do it um with my own life. Who am I close to? Who am I not close to? What are my goals? What are my not goals? And to kind of, instead of just to like put it all in like bullet form or to just Google Doc it, it's like, no, get a nice piece of paper or a whiteboard or whatever, and really kind of yeah, do the mapping thing. Because once you do that, once you create the diagram of the self and the diagram of your life or whatever, then you can start to then you have a mental, it's kind of something you can quote unquote grasp onto, that then you can use for other things. So that is, I think, be a mapper is what I'm hearing from you, which is good advice. I want to ask you, kind of, as we get into pseudo rapish mode here. One is for our listeners, man, you have these 9 laws of cognition, which are so good. And as I read them, I was just like, oh my God, all these are bangers. Like, they're just like, they were so good. I was just like, um, and so I guess I want to ask you, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out all 9 of them, and then I'm going to ask you to say your favorite one, and then the one you think is kind of the you're going to have to choose your killed children. Like, if you were to choose your favorite and then choose your least favorite, that's what you're going to do. So I'm going to just read them out. The first one is, there are no benefits without costs. The second is, action molds perception. The third is, feeling comes first. The fourth is, the mind can override perception. The fifth is, cognition mirrors perception. The sixth, which we've talked about a lot today, is, spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought. 7 is, the mind fills in missing information. 8 is, when thought overflows the mind puts it into the world. And then 9 is, when we organize the stuff in the world the way we organize the stuff in the world the way we organize stuff in the mind. And so we kind of chat about a couple of those, like number 6 about spatial thinking, number 8 about when thought overflows the mind, it goes into the world, number 9 about organizing stuff in the world the way we organize stuff in the mind. So there's a lot of kind of the feeling comes first one stuff. So they're all kind of juicy and good. What's your what of the 9? Yeah, what's your favorite child?
so I'm going to turn that back to you. And which one do you think we haven't discussed that might be
Ooh,
worth
yeah,
discussing?
no, that's a good question. I would love to discuss. Um, I would love to discuss feeling comes first.
Well, feeling comes first, I said at the outset, and that's the basic decision is approach or avoid.
Yeah. Okay.
And approach is positive, feel good. I'm excited for that. Avoid is I'm afraid of that. I don't want to go there. It might harm me. What's interesting about that, and one of the first things I ever learned in psychology, is for humans at least, and probably even for viruses or amoeba, those can be mixed. There are things that I have want to approach and want to avoid. I mean, going down to the or going starting with temptations, like wouldn't it be wonderful to eat those delicious looking desserts, and then maybe I shouldn't. Uh, and so we have those approach avoidance situations, and inevitably in space and in real life we're conflicted, and that is almost an existential a dilemma that humans have and have to deal with all their lives and in many ways. So even small children, the electric outlet is terribly, you just want to put your fingers in it, right? There are holes there and they're just right for fingers. And you somehow have to either cover them up or teach a child that no, don't put your fingers in that. So the world is replete with those dilemmas of things that we want to approach but might harm us, and that we have to deal with in many ways all our lives. So I made that simple, the approach avoidance, but and sometimes it is simple. You're a small child being picked up from nursery school, and your parent comes and you run toward them. But even those, by the time kids are 2 or 3, they want to go back to their friends too. So that becomes conflicted. So I made it a little, and again, it's spatial. Do I run to the mother or the father or the grandmother who's picking you up, or do I go back with the kids? And you often see people wavering.
Yeah.
So that again becomes yeah, I oversimplified it. I mean, the mind oversimplifies all the time, and that I didn't put. It could be a tenth cognitive a law that we tend to categorize instead of seeing things on dimensions. It makes things much easier. There are good people and bad people, Democrats and Republicans, foreigners and citizens, and we tend without seeing gradations. And in our era, that is seeing gradations is essential, and perspective taking is essential. And again, they're both spatial. We think of things as on a line, and we don't want to group them into good and bad. We want to see that people are essentially both good and bad, and we want to. So it those are spatial issues and perspective taking. So if I had to leave with kind of messages for larger activities than just navigating space, but navigating life. Those would be some, and they're lessons we have to learn repeatedly. It's just too easy to
Yeah.
say something's a table or a chair, and ignore the fact that some things can function quite well as both. Um,
Yes. I love that. I love that kind of example of, well, yeah, thinking about feelings as, yeah, that the core thing is, yeah, the approach. There's feelings like happy and sad, but it's all like the approach avoid is a really good way to think about, yeah, that those things come up within you all the time. Oh, we're excited. We both approached each other for this. I emailed you, and then you emailed me back, and we're like, great, let's do this. And then we avoided, I don't know, the rats in our basement or something. And so, yeah, that kind of, our life is full of these things that we're being pulled to or away from. And then similarly, yeah, I totally agree on the seeing things as gradients versus, in our mind is so desirous to kind of categorize and simplify all the time, just doing that. But then, as you said, I think doing it with simple things where it's like, it might be hard for me to think about, my ex-girlfriend or whatever as a nice person, or, but it's easier if I take, to start something like a table and a chair, and just to have a little bit more of a flexible mindset. Like, what? That chair could also be a table, and that table could be a chair. And so to start having that kind of flexible mind around kind of other things in your life is good. So I want to ask you one kind of final question here, which is a couple of these overrated and underrateds. And so I'm going to say a thing, and then you're just going to tell me whether you think it's overrated or underrated, and then give me one sentence, or one sentence on why. And the first one, Apple just came out with their new Apple Vision, VR AR thing. Do you think that VR and AR is underrated or overrated?
so again, I'm going to resist simplification. I'm more excited about VR, about AR, augmented reality. And it's partly I've been working with people doing that, but it's more that I can see the potential. I go to an archaeological site, and my augmented reality will show me what it looked like. Or I go to a museum and I see a painting, and my augmented reality will give me other paintings of the same painter, some historical context, and so forth, whatever I want. But I'm still looking at the painting. I go to a sports event, and I mean, television does this a bit now, But it'll show me other cases where this batter struck someone, it struck a home run. It'll show me statistics about that batter or about the pitcher. But I'm still enjoying watching the game, and I'm getting more information while I'm watching them. I'm trying to put together Lego or put together my kid's bicycle, and augmented reality gives me instructions. So I'm more excited about that. Virtual reality takes me away from the world. And that's great for gaming. It can also work a bit for social situations, although the meta experiment was pretty much a failure on that. But we're using something close to it. When during the pandemic, many of us had Zoom meetings with family that we couldn't see, and those sorts of things might have been more fun if we'd had a fuller immersive experience from that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, but so as what I'm hearing is, yeah, VR probably overrated, AR underrated. Beautiful. Well, with that, Barbara, thank you so much for coming on today. And just as a reminder for listeners, definitely check out her book. It's called Mind in Motion: How Action Shapes Thought. And it's, yeah, if you're interested at all in the stuff that we chatted about today about the kind of, yeah, spatial cognition, and especially getting deeper on the kind of all the studies and the science and all of that. There's a lot of really good stuff of that in the book. Barbara, do you have anything else to say to our listeners today?
One thing, one thread from before,
Yeah.
the categorization versus dimension.
Yeah.
I mean, language categorizes. So it's built in, and it has to. We want few words so we can communicate efficiently, but it's a little bit of an issue of language, and keeping things a little spatial keeps things keeps things truer to what they really are. And right. So maybe I'll leave you with that, with
Wait,
another
that's
thought.
juicy. Let me just to make sure I understood that. Yeah, that it's a any kind of language. Like if I take an abstract, if I take all these cats that I know in the world and I turn them, language turns them into a cat, a single cat thing. And so that's kind of a binary thing. While that other thing is a dog or whatever, and that is helpful most of the time and is true most of the time. But if we want to stay in this reality that is more kind of closer to reality in terms of its spatial, instead of taking the real world and then kind of compressing that information into vocal language, we can take the real world, almost keep it as the real world by keeping it spatial, and then that might be more true. Is that right?
Sure. I mean, that's one. And we want to use both.
But use both. Yeah, totally. Yeah, don't necessarily keep talking to people. Well, beautiful, Barbara. Thank you for this. It's awesome to just hear your yeah, you have a great mindset on all this stuff, and it's cool that you're just like sharing this knowledge with people. So thank you for that. And thank you, listeners, for listening today. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you liked the show, please give us a 5-star podcast review or subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to chat about this episode with a community of amazing, smart, ambitious, divergent people, come on by and join our Discord. You can find it at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. And then finally, if you'd like to contribute to these ideas being shared more widely in society, you can support the podcast production team at patreon.com/Rhys Lindmark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Thanks, and see you here for the next episode. Bye.